Okay, everybody, I think we're going to start again. So the following three talks, I think all of our speakers are members of the Objective Consciousness Modeling Research Group. And the first speaker is Kenneth Williford from University of Texas, Arlington, Department of Philosophy and Humanities. So over to you, Kenneth. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So this is kind of a series of three related talks. I'm going to focus on pre-reflective self-consciousness. David will then, which will take us up to the PCM. David Rudrauf will then talk some more about the PCM and about multimodal integration. And then Gregoire will talk even more about the PCM and about pre-reflective self-consciousness once again. So here's just a quick overview. I'll talk a little bit about phenomenologically invariant structures of consciousness and different modeling paths that those structures sort of encourage. Then a little bit about what we think is one of those important invariant structures, pre-reflective self-consciousness, and then a little bit about how you can get to a kind of skeletal model of pre-reflective self-consciousness, and then on to the PCM. I was going to say a little bit about Douglas Hofstadter and strange loops, and also Francisco Varela and autopoiesis, because in a way they're moving in the same headspace. But just for time's sake, we'll have to skip saying much about that. Okay. So I think if we're going to have a theory of consciousness at all, we have to assume that consciousness has phenomenologically observable structures, that is, structures you can notice from your first-person point of view, and that it, in fact, has the structures that it seems to have. So it seems to have the structure, it does have the structure, at least at some level. Otherwise, what are we doing, right? We have a discipline without a real subject matter. We must assume further that modeling the phenomenologically accessible structures of consciousness at least may lead us to predictions that take us beyond phenomenology and to function if we want to have a genuine scientific model of consciousness, a model that we could say, oh, that's scientifically testable and so on. So it's got to lead beyond the phenomenology at some point, but not, I would say, in the way that a lot of work that goes on in the theory of consciousness, especially but not exclusively in philosophy, a lot of that work is concerned with what's phenomenologically inaccessible or phenomenologically undecidable. For example, ultimate metaphysical issues. So I think we should bracket all of that stuff, right? So apparently invariant structures are the structures to target, not just things that you're not, for example, always in agony, I hope, or oh, there's a lot of variation. You want to pick the structures at a certain level of abstraction that remain no matter what. What are these? Well, there's the common candidates, qualitative character, the what is it like, and so on, or representational character, that its consciousness is always intentional, or what I like to call synthetic character, which has to do with synchronic and diachronic unities and multimodal integration. But I'm going to focus on subjective character, and I'm sure you all know there's kind of a bifurcation in the theory of consciousness. If you think subjective character is not that important or is secondary, then you'll focus on other things. If you think it is important, then you'll focus on different kinds of models. And you might, camps that focus on different things might not always be able to talk to each other. So different theories of consciousness, for example, IIT and global workspace theory, take different candidate invariant structures to be key, and often enough seek to explain the others by derivation in terms of their chosen key, or sometimes they just pencil in things to make it work out. So perhaps some hegemonic theory will end up being right. What I mean by that is a theory that by pursuing one of these structures, you end up getting an explanation of them all. That would be sort of hegemonic. But it could also be the case that we're simply going to have to combine a bunch of different models and try to make it into some kind of coherent whole. But the structure that you find most salient will often enough determine the mathematics you think might be relevant to consciousness. So if you think that information integration is the most salient feature of consciousness, you'll look to certain branches of mathematics for making sense of that, and so on. So for us, pre-reflective self-consciousness has long been, at least I should say for me, pre-reflective consciousness has long been the key feature. Certainly at least a key feature. And pursuing a model of it has led us to look over the 20 or so years of work at Hofstadter's ideas about metamathematical self-reference and strange loops, at Varela's work on self-reference and autopoiesis, at non-wellfounded set theory, which I will talk about here in a minute, and ultimately to projective geometry. It's kind of a long and complicated backstory, but we don't have time for it now, maybe over some beers. So what is the main claim about pre-reflective self-consciousness? It's just that, you can put it in various ways, but that consciousness, however you chop it up, is always in some way or other conscious of itself prior to reflection or introspection, hence pre-reflectively. And you can find people saying this, as early as Aristotle, basically. Here's Antoine Arnaud. Our thought or perception is essentially reflexive upon itself, and in a totally different culture and time. So actually in 19th century Tibet, you find Jamgon Mipam, one of the defenders of this view against its other Buddhist critics, saying that to say that there's no such thing as the self-knowing mind is an amazing misrepresentation. It's like holding something in one's hand and saying one is not carrying it. Like, are you aware of yourself? No. Okay. How did you know that? So there's a kind of a path to get to the model or quasi-model or proto-model that I'd like to talk about. One path is to think about regress arguments in this context. So historically, people articulated the view that consciousness was always aware of itself by considering a kind of regress argument that goes like this: every act of consciousness is the object of another act of consciousness in the same conscious mind, and there aren't any cycles. So you can't have, A being aware of B and then B being aware of A, or any other cycle. And there is at least one act of consciousness. So if you've got that, then you've got infinitely many. So I like to say that's the turtles all the way up approach. There is one philosopher who thought that was true. That's Spinoza. Yes, of course, a stack of infinitely many ideas in my head, no problem, right? Now, if you think, well, the way to get out of this regress, but keep premise one, well, the way to do it is to just say, no, there can be cycles. And how big do they need to be? Well, parsimony would say there's just one. This is a conscious episode's aware of itself. All right. But then the response is, but you've got an internal regress that threatens. So consider this: any act of consciousness that's conscious of itself is conscious of its consciousness of anything it's conscious of, and so is conscious of its consciousness of itself, and of its consciousness of its consciousness of itself, and so on. So you can get a kind of internal regress, and this is more like, this video feedback loop and the Royce map, if you know what that is, a map that has the exact map in it, and so on. And that's from Douglas Hofstadter's I'm a Strange Loop, one of his themes. So how do you get out of this regress? Right, this basically, this regress says, you know, you've got your awareness of 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 your awareness all the way in for each distinct thing, each distinct awareness fact, if you want to call it that. How to get out of that? That's, oh yeah, that's the turtles all the way in regress. Well, if you're willing to say that in this sequence of looks like ever complexifying facts that you're aware of, if you're willing to say, no, actually, somewhere in that sequence is the first term. So it is a cycle. So this is kind of represented by this equation here, where something is its own successor, if you like. So for some x for some successor of your initial conscious state, it's aware of its successor. It's conscious of its successor. It's identical to it. So what this looks like is something a little weird, which is that an episode or act or state of consciousness is identical to its relation to itself, which sounds very puzzling. Like what could it be for something to be its relation to itself? And I say this is the Kierkegaard model because it kind of reminds you of something Kierkegaard said, that the self is a relation that relates itself to its own self. That's what the self is. Right? Note the implicit anti-homuncularism of it. So the self is not some entity over and above its relation to itself and, of course, to its other objects. So we can call this solution SK for Kierkegaard. So how can we make sense of the claim that something could be its relation to itself and to something else? Well, you can actually make sense of it in hyperset theory, the theory of non-wellfounded sets, a set theory that allows sets to be in their own membership chains. So we could think of the minimal case as having this kind of structure. C is ordered OC. And C is both like a relation instance, since it is this relation instance, and like an element, something that can be in the very relation that it itself is. So it's not unusual in set theory to treat relations as on a par with elements in some sense, but it is interesting that in hyperset theory, a relation can be related to something else by itself, so to speak. This reminds us of the Kierkegaard solution. And set C, like other sets, this little example C, has a parasitic identity. It's partly defined in terms of its elements, which I think you would want for consciousness. In that sense, it's not a self-standing entity, which is nice because it avoids homuncularism. Like we don't have this self-homunculus on the one hand relating to some object. So it's one structure in which you get this kind of relationality, but brought about by the relation itself. All right. So in an old paper, I had a kind of proto version of this. And you could sort of think of the sequence of states of consciousness. Notice that in all these sequences, Cn is NCn and Cn plus 1 is NCn plus 1, and so on. And what do you think? What is the ordering? That's just a very, 10,000 feet description of whatever goes on under attention, unification, integration, and so on. So it doesn't tell you what any of those things are, just that there's some kind of ordering here. Consciousness is an organized thing. You can also capture protension and retention in here, as Husserlian terms for anticipatory, expectation and remembering what just happened, like working memory. And you can get the notion of self-acquaintance, that's pre-reflective self-consciousness, because the thing is in its own membership chain. That's how that's captured. And if you allow elements, you can think of those as hyletic data in Husserl's sense, And then you can have functions on those data or operations on those data that yield intensional objects. And if you take the transitive closure over this set, you can get like all of the objects of acquaintance, all of the objects that are accessible, if you like, to consciousness itself. And then again, you get this non-homuncularity, which is nice. And you also get, we don't have time to go into it, but an interesting fact that you can't individuate hypersets using the axiom of extensionality anymore. So you have a kind of sense in which there's this circular entity that can't be fully reduced. So it's parasitic in a way on its contents, but it can't be fully reduced to them. All right. So it's just a skeleton. It's not a full model, but it does demonstrate the possibility of capturing pre-reflective self-consciousness without an infinite regress. So I think that's the significance of it, really. Like you might have thought, no, there's no way we can do this without some kind of regressive. And you just look at the literature, you see that people are still saying this. But no, you can capture it without a regress. And you can also capture these interesting features like being a relation that relates itself to something, which might have seemed like just like, how could you make any sense of that? Sort of. All right. So I'm sorry, I apologize to those of you who have seen this back of a napkin. That's what BON means. The back of a napkin model. Seen me present this like 3,000 times. But the idea is you can, with this notion, with the kind of directed graphs, but you can also translate it over into the language of sets if you like. You can kind of get the sense of, okay, a structure over time, all the little word, oops, that's what I'm looking for. Oh, that means self-awareness, basically. The loop, the retention, the protension, the animation of hyletic data, to use Husserlian terms. So you can get an idea of, okay, it is a beads on the string model. And if you start to think about time, everything goes crazy and it becomes impossible. But anyway, so think of it as a kind of beads on the string skeletal model. Okay, so the proto-model just discussed, it's kind of skeleton with heuristic value. It does, however, demonstrate, as I said, that there is a non-regressive way to represent pre-reflective self-consciousness. I think that's an important thing. A non-regressive, I should say, non-regressive, and one that respects the genuine circularity of it, that doesn't give you some kind of ersatz self-consciousness. So to me, higher order thought theory and higher order perception theory, they are working off the same intuition that the conscious states are the ones that we're aware of being in, but they don't respect the circularity because they think that can't be like that. So they say, oh, yeah, that part's kind of an illusion, and then they give you kind of ersatz subjectivity. Okay. Oh, I should say, since I'm in Germany, for my friends in Heidelberg, or for my Heidelberg school friends, it also preserves the relationality of it. So that when we say I'm aware of myself or I'm conscious of myself, it is actually a kind of relation to myself and not some kind of unanalyzable, mysterious monadic property that I can't say anything more about, or some kind of mysterious thing. I love my friends from Heidelberg. We disagree about that. Anyway, so in our 2022 paper, we argued, that's pre-reflective self-consciousness and projective geometry. We argued for making sense of pre-reflective self-consciousness in terms of the duality and reciprocity inherent in phenomenal space as characterized by the PCM. And one way you might think of this is when it comes to the circularity that we just represented very straightforwardly by a non-well-founded set. As I said, that's kind of a skeleton. It doesn't tell you what's really the guts of the thing. And this is further step toward that, a step toward giving you a theory that's not just a sketch, not just a back of a napkin model. One thing, though, that is important to realize, and this is also something that comes up a lot in discussions with my Heidelberg School friends. They kind of want to think of it as like, well, you're postulating some kind of extrinsic relation between consciousness and itself, a relation it might or might not bear to itself. And doesn't that seem inadequate? And I would agree that seems inadequate. It's not like you might or you might not represent yourself in a court of law, or you might not be referring to yourself depending on the definite description you're using and what room you happen to be in or something like that. It's not like that. It has to be internal to the structure of consciousness itself. And it looks a whole lot like identity in a way, but it's not identity. The non-well-founded model does capture that with this kind of intrinsic circularity. The PCM model captures it in a different way. There's a circularity here, but it also gets the notion that it's just a necessary feature of the structure of consciousness. It's not some extrinsic thing. Okay, so the PCM offers a deeper analysis of pre-reflective self-consciousness and locates it in a framework that captures much more about consciousness than my model than any model from 30,000 feet could, kind of skeletal model. The circularity of pre-reflective self-consciousness is captured in the PCM in terms of projective duality, and Gregoire is going to be talking more about that. And I should say it also, I said that before, didn't I? Right, that it's an intrinsic structure and not a mediated or external relation. Okay, so thanks everybody, and thanks to my home school for giving me